So that's why you can have bank runs and liquidity crises and all these things, even though it looks like the bank has a lot of leverage to create money.
So what's the net result? Why should we care?
Well, the net result, for one thing, is banking crises like we just had. Supposedly, FDIC insurance prevented that, but obviously it didn't. Supposedly, the Federal Reserve Act prevented that in the U.S., but obviously it didn't. I mean, any regulations they impose not only don't seem to cure the problem, they often make it worse. Like the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve has admitted to being largely responsible for that because of bad policies, misguided policies. So there's that. You can't really trust your federal government. Even if they mean well, they just don't have it right. But also, well, with this in the U.S., with this recent bailout, Wall Street not only has not been penalized for that, they have, Wall Street meaning the big banks, they have become stronger than ever. Now they virtually own Congress. After they were at fault and caused this collapse, that there were so many concessions made in favor to preserve Wall Street, to keep it going, that now there's practically no hope of change on the federal level. That's why my particular thing is change at the state level, because the states are really hurting. They need to do something, and they can do something, which is to set up their own state-owned banks. It seems to me we can't really fight Wall Street. What we have to do is beat them at their own game.
So the Congress you're saying that they're 100% dependent upon Wall Street to create the nation's money supply. Hence the reason why we can't just let a bank go bankrupt, or we seem to have this dependency upon banks when really they should just be ordinary companies that we shouldn't really care about too much.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well that brings an interesting point. So tell me, what's a public bank, and what would that look like?
Okay, in the U.S. we have one state-owned bank, and that's in North Dakota. North Dakota is the only state that escaped the credit crisis, totally.
Really?
In fact, they came out with ahead. They have the biggest budget surplus they've ever had. They have the lowest unemployment rate in the country. They have the lowest default rate on loans. So basically what they have is their own central banking system, which is protecting their own local banks. You know, now we have this competition. We've had it for over 100 years between the state banks and the federal banks. The big banks are just taking over. They're gobbling up the little banks, and it's the little banks that have an interest in making loans to local business and local consumers. So in North Dakota, they don't have that problem. They've strengthened their local banking system.
And you're saying the difference between North Dakota and, say, all the other states which were hugely affected by the crisis is that their central bank works exactly the same as the others, however it is controlled by the state.
It works differently. Like the Federal Reserve is set up to serve the banks, and even if they wanted to, in fact it was requested that they could maybe extend the same sort of credit to the state and local governments, which are hurting because of Wall Street's actions. And the Fed said, no, we can't do that. It's not that they don't have the money, they have plenty of money. I mean, they can create money. It's because it's not in the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act is set up to serve the banks, Whereas in North Dakota, they do extend credit. They help the local banks, they help the local farmers, and they help the municipal governments, and they have a credit line to the state itself. So if the state has a problem, they just hit up their own credit line to their own state bank and get back on track.
Okay, so what would you say to a critic of a state-owned bank that might say something like, well, if you give the power to create money to a state, then for political reasons they'll create money, and you look at some of the case studies in the past, I mean, we're thinking Zimbabwe and Germany, what's going to stop them creating too much money?
Well, they don't really create money. I mean, they act like an ordinary bank, and in North Dakota, we've got, and I'm now head of the Public Banking Institute, and so we have two retired bankers from the Bank of North Dakota who are consultants for us. And they say that if you're going to set up a state-owned bank, it's very important to make sure it's run by bankers, it's independent, and it's they're not a development agency. They're not there to do what the politicians tell them
What
what
is
to
their
do.
goal? What are they there to do?
Well, they do have it in their mandate to serve the public interest, and they have certain projects. They agriculture, and they're an agricultural state, so, and oil. So agriculture and energy are two things that they particularly service. So they've helped with the infrastructure for both agriculture and oil. They give very low interest loans to startup farmers, that sort of thing. But it's in their mandate to serve the public interest. They can't speculate, trade for their own purposes, all the things that the Wall Street banks are guilty of. They can't do it. It's not in their mandate to do it.
So what if there's loads and loads of projects out there that need funding, all very, very worthy cause? Are we going to be in a scenario where we're creating so much money that we have massively rising prices?
Well, they're not creating money any more than Wall Street is creating money. They only fund, they create the money to go with the project. In other words, they extend the credit to fund the projects. So if you have goods and services rising at the same rate as the money supply, you don't have inflation, right? Inflation only occurs when you have too much money competing for too few goods. But if the new money goes to create new goods, then prices remain stable.
Okay, so very much part of the goal of them would be to have some kind of control on the level of inflation as well? Or?
No, because it's not, I mean, that's just not an issue. And I think that's where the Federal Reserve has largely gone wrong. Because, for instance, right now, they've created all this money, but there's $1.6 trillion in excess reserves just sitting on the books of the banks. Why? Because the Fed was so worried about inflation that they've sterilized all that money, as they say, by they're paying interest on the money. So they're paying these banks not to lend when the whole point of having that excess money was to lend. So if they just would let the system work organically, it seems to me it's because they have these certain mandates that actually mess up the system.
Yeah. Well, final point, Ellen, it's been really interesting, but perhaps you could just give us a vision of what you think the world would actually look like if we did move to such a system of a state-owned central banking system.
Yeah, well, my thought would be that this would just be a model. I mean, when you see that a public bank works so much better than a private bank, ultimately, credit itself should be a public utility. It should be something that everyone has access to, just like a public library. And I know there's one theory that banks should hold 100% reserves. In other words, they can't loan money they don't have. But I would say 0% reserves. And the reason, and because it would be a public utility, a public bank.
So that essentially removes the ability to create money with zero reserves?
Well, that would mean that your ability to get a loan is not dependent on the bank having taken somebody else's deposits. You're not shuffling money around in this pool of other people's deposits, and it's not dependent on a pot of gold. It's not limited by some, arbitrary sum that the bank might have, and if the bank doesn't have it, then you could lose your deposit because they go bankrupt because they're sharing the pool. That's not what credit is. Credit is an overdraft on your own account. It's an overdraft on your promise to pay. So you come to the bank and you say, here's my business model, here's how I plan to pay it back. You're saying basically to the community, trust me with your goods and services, I will build something with it and I will make a profit and I will give it back to you with a profit. So it's not dependent on a pool of money, it's only an extension of your own credit, or an extension of the community's credit, or the trust of the community with their goods and services, so that you'll build something out of it and return something to the community.
So leave us with that vision. I interrupted you there. What would the world look like if everything changed as you recommend in the book?
Well, it would actually be rather like a giant community currency system. It's all debits and credits. And so the public bank would just be in charge of overseeing this exchange of debits and credits. So if you wanted a loan, you would go to the bank, take out a debit and pay it back with credits, with whatever you built with the loan.
And
so it'd be totally organic. It wouldn't be, this amount of money wouldn't be determined by an independent body that could mess it up, as we've seen the Federal Reserve do time and again, probably unwittingly, but they are messing it up. It would be totally determined from the bottom by people themselves would create the credit by taking out loans.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting. I really encourage people to get the Web of Debt book. Where can they find out more? I think you've got a very active blog, haven't you? Where you
Yeah, I have a website, webofdebt.com, and publicbankinginstitute.org, and yeah, I have a blog connected to my website.
Okay, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.